Hello everyone and welcome to another Seraphim LinkedIn live webinar. Today we're here to discuss the findings from the release of yesterday's Seraphim Space Index. This quarter has seen a significant rebound in SpaceTech Investment and the highest number of deals ever recorded. Let's go over to the experts to find out more. I'm pleased to welcome today Seraphim investors Trisha Saxena. Hi Trisha.
Hi Leah. Hi everyone.
And you've met before, Maureen Haverty. Hi Maureen.
Hi Leah. Hi everyone.
Thanks for joining me today. I'll get straight to the questions. Trisha, can you briefly explain to everyone what is the Q1 index?
Sure. So every quarter, we look at private investment that has gone into private space startups in the previous quarter. And we've been tracking this investment activity since the beginning of 2017. So what we look at is all of the funding rounds that have happened in the last 3 months, and we look at what sorts of companies received this funding, at what stages, and in which geographies. And that gives us a sense of the health of the private space sector. One important note that to a change that we've made this quarter is that previously we used to track drone companies as well as part of the Space Index. And this was because we felt that drone platforms were seen as complementary to satellites and they could be used for similar applications. However, given the growing number of pure play space tech companies, we've decided that including drones is no longer appropriate. And so we've updated our Space Index to include purely space companies, and this enables us to assess the space sector on its own.
Brilliant. Thank you, Trisha. Maureen, what significant changes have you seen since Q4?
I think the most significant change we've seen is that for the very first time, European investment, as an investment in European startups, actually surpassed that of North America, which functionally means the US. That's a huge change. I think, last time we spoke in our Q4 update, and as I wrote in my Via Satellite article, really, could Europe was growing quite significantly, but would it ever be able to catch up with the US? And the fact that it actually did so already this quarter is pretty astounding. That's driven by, I think, two factors. Investment in the US still seems to be continuing to fall, whereas it's growing in Europe. I mean, it's very early stages. We're only in Q1, but it really seems, investment in Europe has grown quite a bit. And I think that's driven by the drive for space sovereignty that we've seen a lot in Europe in the last 6 months in particular, both in launch and in constellations, particularly communications constellations. European governments have spoken about it quite a bit. And that's been, I think, encouraged European investors who tend to be a bit more risk averse to say, okay, well, actually, there's going to be support from the government in terms of contracts. There's going to be a market here that de-risks my investment quite a bit. And that's something that actually SpaceX managed to leverage very successfully in the US. So, if we see that trend continue, it could really kickstart the European investment ecosystem for space.
That's really exciting to hear. Thanks, Maureen. If anyone wants to look at our index while we're discussing this, we'll find it on our website. And also we'll be taking questions throughout. So please post questions in the chat and we can pick them up at the end. Trisha, I'll go to you next. While the last 12-month investment is down versus the last 12-month period, investment in the quarter is meaningfully up from the last quarter. What does this show for the sector?
Yeah, so I think everyone can agree that 2021, for example, was a huge year for private investment, not just in space, but across all industries. And then in 2022, we saw a bit of a pullback. But then if we compare this quarter to the end of 2022, we can see that more deals and more capital was invested. Almost 1.5 million went into private space startups in the first 3 months of this year. It's too early to know whether that trend is going to continue throughout 2023, but we can say that for sure that investment activity seems to be picking up. And I think one of the reasons for that is, of course, investors who have let dry powder build up throughout the past year. They're now looking for good quality deals to invest in and good quality space startups. And at the same time, these space startups who maybe held off on funding last year, maybe they looked at different ways to extend runways, they're now going back out to market to top up their funding. And I think that dynamic has meant that there's a lot more startups to be funded and a lot more investors that are willing to fund them. And I think in space in particular, what's interesting this previous quarter is that there's been an increase in the number of companies in much more capital intensive sectors being funded. So beyond Earth and launch companies, for example, have been relatively resilient in the last few months. And I think this trend can suggest sort of growing investor appetite for these potentially higher risk subsectors, or a perception that these sectors are now getting de-risked as more and more of the technology gets developed. So I think for space as a whole, I think we're seeing sort of cautiously optimistic investors returning to the sector, and of course startups themselves who are now going out to raise rounds again this year.
Great to hear. Maureen, what kind of round sizes are we seeing in Q1?
So generally what we're seeing is that round sizes are actually tending to increase. The median round size is continuing to grow. So I think, last year seed was about 1.5 million. It's about that now, and that had grown previously. So actually all round sizes are up at each stage, except for D+, which is way down. So we're seeing, either an absence of D+ rounds, or they're much smaller. And that's something that we saw in 2022. No mega rounds. 2022 was the year of the seed round. And certainly we haven't seen any mega rounds so far this quarter.
Has anything surprised you, Tricia, about the round size, or anything else for that matter?
Sure. I think there are a couple of things, definitely this quarter at least, that have been surprising. One of them we've touched on already was the fact that investment into Europe actually outpaced the investment that went into the US or North America, which hasn't really happened in the past. And I think a lot of this was driven by, again, launch companies, which I've mentioned before. There were almost 6 or 7 rounds of launch-related startups raising more than 30 million each. The largest one being the German company ISAR Aerospace, which raised $165 million round. And this is one of the largest rounds we've seen through the companies that we track in the index in the last year or so. So that's definitely surprising. And I think, again, it's too early to say whether that will continue throughout the year, but it's definitely notable that Europe has seen that large increase in funding. And in fact, in the top 10 deals of the quarter, almost half of them were European companies. And I think what's also interesting, and that we saw sort of emerging towards the end of last year, was the number of seed stage companies. So these are very early stage companies that are being founded and being funded. And that number continues to grow. And I think that really points to kind of, founders still being excited about the sector and still wanting to operate and found companies in space.
You just mentioned launch, and someone, Phil Hodges, actually asked a question which we can pick up now, perhaps. He's asked, is there a SpaceX equivalent in Europe? Is that something? Maureen, is that something on the cards?
I think there's a lot of companies that ultimately would have ambitions to cover the full market in the way that SpaceX has done. I think obviously the thing is that, we see SpaceX now as a very full service company, but, it initially started out just in launch, and then really established a dominant position there before expanding into constellations. It's now actually building satellites for other people as well, for the government, and actually maybe doing a white label constellation for the government. So if we look at who could be a SpaceX in Europe, there's, I think we're looking at who could actually really deliver a full end-to-end solution for customers. Potentially some of the companies working on launch, such as, ISAR or Rocket Factory Augsburg. If you were to take a very traditional SpaceX route, they might be something like that. But, I don't know if they've got plans long-term to become full end-to-end. Certainly our own portfolio company, D-Orbit, I wouldn't say, they're trying to compete with SpaceX, but they really are offering a full end-to-end solution. So they have our orbital tugs to help get you to the right orbit, but also they're working on edge computing for, using their left behind orbital tugs to do a distributed network of edge computing. And they can also host payloads and provide kind of space as a service. So I think, they're starting to really build up their capability. They've got a team of over 200 in Italy, and they've got international teams as well. So I think you see what people do is they establish an expertise in a certain area, and then they build from that to become a more full-serviced company.
So I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Trisha. I cut you off then, or did Maureen cover it?
No, I think that's a great answer. Nothing to add.
What are you most excited about for the rest of 2023? Maureen, I'll go to you on that one.
Yeah, I think I'm really, really excited by this trend of increased investment in Europe, particularly at the growth stage. So in 2022, investment was up, the number of investments was up 50% in Europe and 80% in Asia. And I think, the big question I had is like, clearly these areas are, really starting to found a significant number of high quality, as in venture investment worthy startups, but can they actually fund them to scale, and can they actually do growth? And certainly the early indications this quarter is that actually, yes, they can, which is really exciting. And hopefully that trend continues, that we can continue to see investment to allow these companies to scale. Because if that trend happens, that will lead to a really dynamic space industry in Europe. And I think, we've seen the achievements that have happened in the US, and I'm sure we'd love to see those replicated internationally. So it's nice to see that other regions are capable of doing the same.
Thanks, Maureen. Trisha, earlier on you mentioned investment in the quarter has increased by 75%. What is this telling us about the confidence in the space market right now?
Yeah, I think not just investment increasing, but also the number of deals we're seeing has reached almost all-time highs. In the last quarter alone, we saw 129 companies being funded, and in the last 12 months, over 400 companies. And so the number of early stage deals as well is kind of continuing to grow. So if we look at seed stage deals, for example, almost 55% increase year on year. And so, comes back to my point on founders of these new companies and new entrepreneurs. They're not being discouraged by, what's happening kind of in the broader macroeconomic environment. And, they're still enthusiastic about the sector and continuing to found new space companies. I think what's interesting is that if you look at the top deals this quarter, 4 of them were companies involved in servicing the in-space economy. And that sort of highlights, potentially a substantial market, or, investors believing that there's a substantial market for these businesses operating in space. And the fact that a significant proportion of the funding has gone to them might show that investors are kind of getting more comfortable with this sector as a whole, especially if they're looking at these much more capital intensive deals. And I think looking more broadly at the space market, if you look at downstream companies, those which utilize data from space or connectivity from space, they don't necessarily operate in space themselves, but they are companies that are enabled by advances in space tech. Even those businesses, such as downstream product companies, which are addressing things from insurance to climate, they've been pretty resilient in funding over the past year as well. And I think it's because these companies are able to attract funding from a much wider range of investors. And that ends up boosting the profile of these space-enabled businesses and gets new investors more excited and more comfortable about space as a whole.
Thanks, Trisha. Investment across the space sector you recorded was up from 801 million to 1.4 billion. I know Maureen, Trisha, just touched on some of the sectors there, but Maureen, what other sectors is this money going into?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to think about. It's what sectors are growing, and then what sectors are maybe attracting very large rounds. So I think, as Trisha pointed out, in the top 10, 4 of them were servicing the in-space economy, which is very exciting. I think one thing we definitely saw is that even though there's a perceived, and there probably is, a pullback from capital-intensive businesses, such as launch, such as constellations, very hardware-focused, I think what we saw is that even though there might be a pullback, because they're so capital intensive, they do tend to need these large rounds. So they do actually make it onto the top 10. And I think that's probably likely to be the case for some time. So, to raise a large round, you probably have big capital needs, and therefore who needs a lot of capital is still launch and hardware. And even if they're slightly less attractive than they used to be, it's still going to put you onto the top 10. the one area that we're seeing growth in the last 12 months is still product. And I think, Trish touched on this, that, one, maybe it's because they can attract outside investors. I think, there's also a need for maybe perceived lower capital requirements, perceived better ability to scale. Also, potentially some of these companies can have much earlier stage revenues, and there's definitely a focus amongst VCs on, do you have revenues earlier on your company life cycle, which is the case in most sectors. So it's not, it's just a bringing that quality mindset to space. And why do investors want that right now, especially in 2022, 2023, when the economy is having a downturn? One, if you have revenue, you'll have less external financing requirements, which is always a good thing. And the best way to grow a business is by growing your revenue, not by relying on external investors. So there's that focus there. But also, I think there's a greater focus on demonstrating product market fit. I think, some of the criticisms that maybe what happened in 2021 was, it was just, it's a build and will come attitude. They will come attitude. And now there's more of a, no, you need to have a specific product and demonstrate that specific product's meeting customers' needs. One thing that Trisha kind of touched on, and I kind of want to get across, is actually, our analysis from 2022 found that for VC and private equity investing was down about 25% for space. That's actually less than in other industries. It seems like, the latest analysis from PitchBook is that VC generally was down about over 50%. So actually space is outperforming more generalist, venture investing startups in terms of attracting investment. And I think the major reason for that is because space has really proven how useful it is and how important it is in 2022. And I think we're going to see that continuing.
That's a really great point. Thanks, Maureen. You both touched a little bit on deals sizes. Tricia, would you go into a little bit more? Why are they growing so significantly?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the interesting things in Q1 was that we saw specifically growth stage deal sizes beginning to recover from the levels in last year. And this was seen kind of at Series B and Series C, so early stage growth companies. And I think one of the reasons could be that these companies, once they're at these stages, they've typically maybe validated their technology. They're maybe seeing some early recurring revenues from customers. And those sorts of fundamentals where, investors are looking for things like strong revenues, strong cash flows, future profitability, those things become much more attractive at those stages. And so I think that's promising. And I think it shows that investors are more confident about growth stage companies, especially in the space sector. I think then if you look at in terms of actual subsectors within space, we've seen beyond Earth companies, launch companies, satellite platform companies, those are also experiencing larger funding rounds. And that's, of course, because these sorts of businesses tend to need more capital in the first place, but also that investors are getting more comfortable with funding those sorts of businesses. A lot of these in the past quarter, as we've mentioned many times, are based in Europe. And I think in Europe, European governments, the EU, they've put a huge focus on space sovereignty in launch and constellations. And that could be one of the big drivers for why investors are getting more comfortable, given that there's a lot of support from kind of governments in these areas as well.
Thank you, Tricia. Did you want to take a question about the rise in early stage investments in the EU versus the USA, India, and China? A question from Kashmir.
Yeah, sure. I think definitely we're seeing huge amounts of activity at the early stages. Pre-seed, seed, Series A companies, and for sure these companies have been some of the most resilient in the past year. If you look at the last 12 months, at the early stages specifically, unsurprisingly, the biggest geography has been the US, close to sort of 125 early stage deals in the last 12 months. most of those have been in sort of beyond Earth companies. And I think, everyone can agree we're seeing a lot of activity in sort of the in-space economy, in the lunar economy. And a lot of that is coming out of the US, where you could argue, it's potentially one of the most developed space economies, and especially to do with startups. And so maybe these companies are able to attract more funding, in the US, which typically, is one of the least conservative geographies when it comes to investing in space. Next, after the US, is Europe. There's been over 100 early stage deals in the last 12 months. And if you look into the details, a lot of those have gone to satellite constellations. And I think it comes back to, a sort of sovereign push for, European capabilities, whether that be communications, whether that be, national security. And I think one of the best examples in Europe, not a private company, but the EU did announce that they wanted to have, their own sovereign secure communications constellation across multiple orbits that they want to have up and running in the next 4 years. And I think that's a good signal for private startups who might also want to address similar sectors, that there is support within Europe for those sorts of activities. And finally, Asia as well. Maybe not as many early stage deals, but still a relatively high number in the last year or so. A lot of that funding has gone to what we classify as build companies. So these are companies that build maybe components or space or subsystems for satellites, and kind of the building blocks that go into space, space systems and constellations. And I think that's really important because, it's a really important part of the supply chain. And a lot of that is coming out of Asia. And equally, there's a lot of sovereign support out in Asia as well. So overall, I think at the early stages to the question, across all geographies, there's been a lot of activity, with the US leading, but, the other geographies not far behind.
We've had a question from Eric Needle. I don't know if, Maureen, you want to pick this one up. If 1 billion doesn't get traction, how does a space economy happen? Is it premature? Fantasy, do you think this will happen quickly?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that comes back to the focus that we're seeing on product market fit. I think, and not to pick on any particular launch company or anything like that, but I do think that generally there has been a lot of small launchers who I think really chose the wrong payload mass, as in the wrong size satellite that they could launch to orbit. And on the basis that we're going to launch, one-off satellites, is going to be maybe 150 kilogram satellite. And the trend actually has been for satellites to get larger again, to around 300 kilograms. And also maybe why it just doesn't work out cost effective to launch a single satellite at 300 kilograms. So I think what we're seeing is that a lot of companies just assumed they would have a market, or they did they didn't do enough product analysis. Their design trades were wrong. And ultimately now we're seeing a move back to a lot of the launch companies moving towards larger launch vehicles. So I think what Virgin Orbit might tell us is, one, that focusing on success and reliably getting to orbit is crucial. Two, that investors and startups didn't focus enough on the right product early on in their company life cycle. And whether you're a launch company or any kind of company as a space company, those are the two things you need to focus on right now. Do you have the right product? Are you talking to your customers, and do you have the right product? How are you demonstrating that you have the right product? And by the way, that's something that basically kills startups in all sectors, not just in space, but learn from those sectors and learn from Virgin Orbit's failure, and then also make sure that you can do something reliably, because you do have competitors who can do things reliably. So I think those are the lessons to be learned there.
So despite of the Virgin Orbit failure that we've just mentioned, there's still a lot to be excited about in the European space industry. Who do you think is exciting you at the moment, Maureen?
I'm excited by some of the companies we saw in the top 10. I think, there's lots of great companies in Europe, but I'll just focus on some of the top 10 because, it's their quarter. ISAR has achieved a lot in a very challenging fundraising environment, has managed to raise a large round, and is considered one of the front runners for launch in space in Europe. So I think that's really exciting. And I think their rocket is actually a good size. I'm excited for Exotrail, an electric propulsion company moving into orbital tugs. They raised a very large round in an area that's kind of quite hard to raise a large round. So I'm excited for them, and congratulations to them. So they're just two of the ones that I'm excited by. But honestly, we've seen a lot of great companies in Europe, particularly at the product side, focused on climate. So we saw Pachama and B0 last year. So there's a lot of exciting things going on, either from the hardware, really space side, to people who are like, I don't have any space engineers on my team. I'm just using space data and building really great and useful products with large markets. And I think that's just as exciting.
Thanks, Maureen. We've just touched on Europe, but obviously everyone knows that the space sector is a global enterprise. Trisha, what markets are now beginning to mature and attract investment?
Yeah, again, just touching on Europe, I think, we've said it many times, but it's definitely, exciting that just in the last quarter, it was the region that attracted more investment than any other geography. But if we look over a longer period, over the last year or so, over the past 12 months, Asia has seen a huge increase in the number of space tech deals, almost doubling versus the previous 12-month period. And I think, again, sovereign support for startups in these sorts of emerging geographies can reduce the perceived risk with associated with investing in these geographies. And that then makes startups more attractive for investors. And that's certainly the case in Asia, where we're seeing new space agencies being created, new space initiatives being created with a very high frequency. I think in the last 12 months, again, a lot of the activity in Asia has been from these more upstream companies, especially launch companies. So in India, for example, we saw 2 large launch rounds last year, Japan as well. And I guess it comes back to one of the earlier questions we have, is there a SpaceX equivalent outside of the US? In launch in particular, some people think we do need a strong non-US based contender to compete with the likes of SpaceX in launch. And this narrative could be driving some of that interest, especially in Asia. And I think more broadly, increasing focus on, especially in Europe, on climate, on ESG, climate resiliency, that's driving a huge number of startups, especially on the downstream side, product companies who are leveraging space data. And that's ended up boosting the profile of these sorts of climate and space tech related businesses in Europe.
Thanks, Trisha. We'll take another question from the audience, question from Razvan. Maureen, I don't know if you want to pick this one up. Is 5G NTN interesting for space VCs? When do you think mobile operators will include these services in their offerings or capabilities?
Thanks, Razvan. I honestly think it's probably the most exciting thing for space VCs this year, certainly. And actually, when I talk to VCs in other sectors and they ask what's the most exciting thing I'm working on, they get jealous. It's actually a huge potential game changer, I think. So I actually have an article on it in Innovation News Network, and I'll link to that afterwards. For those of you that don't know, 5G NTN basically is 5G NTN means non-terrestrial network. And basically what it means is that satellites will be able to directly talk to cell phones. And there are standards related to mobile phones and cell phones, which allow them to work across networks. They're called the 3GPP standards. And the latest release, which determines how your chips are made, how your phones are made, will allow ordinary cell phones to talk to satellites. So I believe Apple is using some of those innovations to talk to Globalstar satellites, but there are a number of companies working on this. SpaceX has announced a partnership with T-Mobile to end dead zones. And Skylo is working with a number of partners, including MediaTek, one of the chip suppliers. So they allow you to talk directly to GEO, so you're leveraging existing satellites. And then Qualcomm has announced partnerships with Iridium. So there are a huge number of partnerships and there's a huge number of developments. I think it's really about 1 to 2 announcements per month at this stage. I think it's going to be a huge area. I think we're definitely going to see low data rate, narrowband communications first. That's what the new standards allow. And I think we will see more and more partnerships, probably between SpaceX and other networks, probably Skylo working to allow you to use, you don't need to launch your own constellation. We'll see Apple rolling out more functionality. Its SOS facility is actually already based on that. I honestly think we could see service from some of these as early as late 2023, early 2024. Really as soon as the new chips start to roll out. So I think it's a really, 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 really interesting area. So definitely, I'm looking at that. Really want to meet any companies working on that. That's low data rate. There's obviously some companies, Link and AST, who are working on broadband, and I think we're really years away from that. We don't even have it for narrowband communication. So I think we're going to see messaging very soon, probably in the next 18 months. And I think voice, we're quite a bit further, and plus, we're quite a bit further away. So as you can tell, I'm extremely excited by this area.
Thanks, Maureen. We've had quite a few questions, which is fantastic. So we'll just continue with those because we're running out of time. I had a good question from Royden D'Souza. Tricia, if you want to pick this one up. Where are you seeing the most focus on innovation? Space for Earth or beyond Earth?
Sure. I think, of course, first thing to note is that we're seeing innovation across both of those areas. Although I think, of course, you can say over the past, 5 or 6 years, a lot of the innovation has been on the Space for Earth segment. A lot of, as kind of launch became cheaper, a lot of satellite companies were able to launch constellations much more cheaply. And that's fed into, applications in climate resiliency, security. And for sure that innovation is continuing. But we've definitely seen a shift in the last couple of years where what we call beyond Earth companies, companies operating in space beyond purely just terrestrial applications, they've seen a huge increase in interest and in funding and, of course, in innovation. We actually recently, towards the end of last year, created an ecosystem map where we mapped out all of the companies operating within the Beyond Earth segment. And we used to have that as part of our sort of usual Seraphim ecosystem map. And we realized that it was growing as a category so hugely, and there were so many new startups being founded that actually, it was worth dedicating an entire sort of map to. And I think that's what's really exciting, not just companies now operating kind of within Earth's orbit or Earth's sphere of influence, but lunar companies as well, and cislunar businesses, those that are looking to opportunities a decade or two down the line, are now also receiving funding. And those prospects are becoming more and more realistic, I think, to some investors. And I think that's really exciting.
Thanks, Tricia. We'll take a question from Zachary. Maureen, with the amount of smaller companies, the challenges with capital markets today, and what looks like to be somewhat crowded marketplace across several other sectors you track and invest in, what do you think M&A will look like in the next coming months?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I definitely think there's going to be consolidation. I think there's going to be acquisitions, some happy, some probably of maybe companies who are in distress. Definitely going to happen. That has happened historically in space. I think maybe it was in the 70s or 80s, there were, lots of smaller space companies, and there was huge consolidation down to where I think there were basically maybe 5 major players in the US, probably with insufficient competition. And then we kind of had this new space surge of new companies. So there's definitely going to be some natural consolidation. I think, to be frank, there are definitely going to be some companies that go out of business. So yeah, I think we'll see there are some of the public companies who are really starting to generate revenue, and I think they're starting to acquire. We're seeing Planet acquiring quite a few companies that are quite strategic for them. We'll definitely see more of that. I think if you look at the big primes, so internationally, Airbus, Thales, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, they certainly in 2022 were sitting on huge amounts of dry powder, like tens of billions of dollars of dry powder, as in they have cash available to make acquisitions. So they can make acquisitions if they want in cash, or because they're publicly traded companies using their shares. So I think we're going to see a lot there. And in fact, I think what we'll see are there's so many companies available that people will actually have to be quite judicious in who they're going to acquire. And just one last thing is that obviously we've seen private equity interest in some companies, including taking some public companies private. So Maxar was taken private. So I think we could see more of that. And I think obviously some of the de-SPAC companies are, I'm not a public market, investor, but, they seem to me to be, some of them are undervalued given the number of contracts they have, given the fact there probably is a good, solid underlying business. So I think my suspicion is we might see some of those being taken private as well.
Thanks, Maureen. I think we'll take one more question. Trisha, have you seen any hesitation of funding from investors when it comes to very new space companies? I think they mean probably very early stage companies without a solid R&D and manufacturing process.
I think, it's difficult to say because at the early stages, there's such a huge variety of space companies. Not all of them are manufacturing businesses, for example. Some of the early stage space companies that we track are maybe on the downstream. They're maybe more software related companies, for example. So I think generally you could potentially say that those sorts of companies find it easier to attract funding. But having said that, we've seen, especially at seed stage, the number of companies that are being founded and funding has increased pretty rapidly over the past few quarters and past few years. And I think it really depends, the types of funds that they're raising money from are perhaps either better educated about the space sector, maybe they're more keen to fund these sorts of companies, or at early stages, typically valuations are lower, so investors are more comfortable investing at those early stages. So there's a few different factors, I think, and just looking at the facts in terms of early stage space companies being funded, it doesn't point to any sort of hesitation, but it depends a lot on the types of subsectors that you're looking at.
Thank you. Thanks, ladies. Thanks both. I think we'll probably pretty much have to call it time there, but if there's anything else we haven't covered that you want to end on before we say goodbye?
Yeah, so actually I'm just seeing a few questions in the chat, I think, that are related to, what trends are we seeing as investors beyond just what this data shows us? And I've started doing this presentation for some talks I'm doing, which I'm calling Anecdata, which is kind of secret trends I'm seeing from startups that are coming in. And based on some of the questions that I see in the chat, I think that might be worthwhile for us to do as a LinkedIn Live. So hopefully that might be useful for some people, because I think there's a lot of questions about what we're seeing as investors.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Maureen. And as we said earlier, you can find the index on our website under research, as well as our ecosystem map that Trisha mentioned. And please, if this will all be recorded and shared on our socials, and if there's more questions you think of after, we'll be happy to answer them in the chat on LinkedIn. So thanks for everyone to joining us today. Thanks.